Well, welcome back. This is R. Michaela Fisher, founder and director of the Fearology Institute. Topic of the video today is on a real common problem in the beginning stages of fearology. Fearology being the transdisciplinary study of fear and its interrelationship with life, in the simple definition. And one of the things that we've been confronted with at the Fearology Institute is attempting to build this domain of knowledge about fearology. And obviously that's about fear, includes fearlessness, knowledge, and the realization of several students, and of course myself over the last 3 decades of pursuing this study, is that there's a great resistance to wanting to know more about fear, wanting to talk about fear, and that doesn't particularly help the knowledge base of improving our knowledge about fear. So I think one of the things that's just automatically a very early beginning part of fearology work is we have to come to some kind of terms with, okay, how are we going to explain this resistance? A resistance to wanting to know more about fear and wanting to, therefore, improve our fear management on the planet. So you'd think we want to improve our fear management. That seems like just an instinctual evolutionary thing, and I think it is true that that's a good assumption to make. At the same time, there are parameters and things that are adding to and contributing accumulatively to what I would say is even almost like a lessening of wanting to know more about fear. Even though there are certain streams of knowledge and pursued academically that are exciting, of new scholarship on fear and lots of books and articles on fear and its management, but there's definitely a tendency still for a massive amount of uninterest or unacknowledged fear that people still do not want to talk about. And so fearology isn't going to grow very fast as long as people are reluctant to pursue it as a specialized topic and as something that even has value or is considered to be valuable. So how are we going to explain this as fearologists, at least have some ideas of how to explain it? So one of the first topics is that fear is negative and has been constructed negatively for a long time. I'm not going to go into that explanation. That's been discussed in other videos and other writing. Philosophy of fearism deals with that. Philosophy of fearlessness, my work, deals with that. I want to pursue something a little more subtle. And so I will talk about existentialism and the philosophy of existentialism, existentialist theory, existentialist psychotherapy, and existentialist social psychology. Just kind of, I'm going to generalize about some understandings and theories and pretty sound and very interesting information they're coming up with recently about the existential fear / terror / anxiety, dread inside human beings in their nature, so-called human nature or human condition. That could be arguable which is which. That will probably be a good explanation of why there's so much resistance to fear. So that's one of the central topics of today's video. The reality is, I was just listening just the other day to a talk by Mary Poffenroff, and she's a promoter right now of fearology in her own definition of fearology. And she was talking on a radio host program, and her main, practical solution to help people, which she really wants to do and good intended, was, recognize fear, then investigate it, get to know it better, find out what it's about, and then act on that knowledge, right, that you've created through recognition, further investigation, and then act on it to manage it, to control it. And, she's promoting this. Well, there are many, many people doing that and have done for many decades. I could go back to many, many books and very formulas and programs on how to feel the fear and do it anyway. And they all have a lot of that very similar formula. And it's basically a pretty cognitive behavioral psychology style and approach and lens. So I don't think that solution and that kind of management is going to help us with this problem. That it'll help a little, but I don't think it's going to deeply help us understand why people are going to be still resistant to exploring fear and understanding a much deeper social, existential, political, philosophical basis for why people really don't want to do this fear management, even the Mary Poffenroth approach or others of cognitive behavioral techniques. So let's slowly move into this existential analysis. And I want to basically suggest we're going to have to include a depth, unconscious analysis of unconscious fears, and not just fears that we can know, like Mary is speaking about and many others, in that cognitive behavioral strategy. Okay, so that's first thing. That's what you can be conscious of. And, maybe something's a little less consciousness and you can make it more consciousness through her little formula. But there are deeper systemic, depth, unconscious patternings that go back historically, that have political weight, and they're there for a very powerful reason. I tend to call that all the fear matrix, which is the hidden, deep, assumed and implicit ways that societies, cultures, worldviews operate. So I'll get to that in a moment. Let me introduce this topic as we dive in on resistance here to a really good little book that's just one of the best that you can find, by Bonaro Overstreet. She was an adult educator, artist, poet, and her husband was a very famous philosopher, Harry Overstreet, American philosopher. So this book, Understanding Fear in Ourselves and Others, and you might notice that Rollo May here, the great existentialist psychotherapist, who's written a lot about the meaning of fear and anxiety, he actually gives a great endorsement to Overstreet's book here. This book came out in 1951 and republished in 1971, the edition I have here, given to me by a good friend. Anyways, I'm going to read the preface to her edition of this little book. Fear is part of our native equipment for staying alive. Its function is to alert us to real dangers. So that's a pretty common discourse you'll find in just about every book on fear these days. And that is, fear is natural. And of course, that even goes way, way back in ancient history. That kind of acknowledgement. However, strangely, she says, if fear gets out of hand, it can involve us in constant self-defensive responses to fictional dangers, and thus condemn us to a living death. That's a powerful term, a living death. And in many ways, when I look at the planet now and the way we're living and the way we're in such denial, still on a massive scale for most people, not all, that the planet is in a cascading crisis of heading toward extinction of many life forms, and that will probably include us pretty quickly as a species. A living death we're kind of living, and still not really choosing to make the kinds of changes that need to be changed. And climate change, global warming, etc. is a big one. And then she opens in her first chapter, which I love. It's called Part 1, The Shape of the Problem, the Fear Problem. And she's asking why our fear problem remains unresolved. And that's what I'm really talking about today, is is there so much resistance to really resolving and fully understanding this fear problem? And that's an argument of the Fearology work that I do, and there's a lot of evidence that we really have not advanced very far. And quite frankly, I don't think there's a better book out fully for most people on the topic of fear than this little one from 1951. And that is 70 years ago nearly, and tells me a lot that there's not been a lot of advancement. There's bits and pieces, but still we're way behind, as I often say in my work. Way behind the 8 ball when it comes to the fear problem. So why our fear problem remains unsolved? Here's our opening line. Of all the emotional forces that pattern our individual and interpersonal behaviors, fear has the most insidious power to make us do what we ought not to do and leave undone what we ought to do. Under its influence and trying to escape its influence, we seem fated to give it a yet stronger hold upon us. This compounding fear has gone on, we can assume, as long as humans have been self-conscious. A lot of things there that we could talk about, but I find that as a very, even though her book is quite psychological, and she does draw on existential thinking and philosophy, and I appreciate that a lot. And again, rare to find a book of the depth that her book has, and that names this fear problem, quote, fear problem, the problem of, the human fear problem, on the opening page. And most people today, I find, like the Mary that I just described earlier, they take such a small piece of the fear problem and put it into a nice little package, and very handleable and very cognitive, behavioral, and psychological, kind of very self-psychology and self-help kind of discourse. Well, Fearology is transdisciplinary, so it cannot by any means just stick to that small discourse, that small cognitive behavioral psychology. It can't even stick to the discipline of just psychology. So we have to open up the understanding and the analysis, critical analysis. And that's what you won't find in those kinds of fear management folks, like Mary's work that I just mentioned. And the main reason is because they don't deal with the unconscious fear. And I'm talking about deeply unconscious, not just unconscious, deep unconscious, and deeper and deeper. And that's where we're talking about how fear has worked in human history from the beginning, human evolution, and particularly in cultural evolution. Again, that's something I call the building of this fear matrix through various fear management strategies that have been used that, for the most part, started to be less and less effective because fear was actually at the basis of the motivation to try to resolve the fear strategy. So fear-based solutions, fear-based analysis was and is continuing to be used, but nobody was sort of, it seems throughout history very well, articulating and challenging and critiquing that very fear-based formation that was quite, again, because it's unconscious for the most part. And it's really only in these postmodern times, postmodern times, I think we can begin to articulate a much more holistic, integral, and bring a lot of that deeper analysis to more consciousness. The real highlight for today in this talk of a way to explain this resistance to talking about fear, getting to know it, probing those deep unconscious layers of the fear matrix that so controls us, is a wonderful work of Ernest Becker, who I've mentioned in other podcasts that I've done on my channel and written about, an existentialist philosopher, cultural anthropologist, a very eclectic thinker. And he has now had his work transposed. Denial of Death was his famous book. And there's been a movie called The Flight from Death, something like that, on his work. But the social psychologists, Tom Pazinski, Greenberg, and Solomon particularly, and I'll put a link to terror management theory that has come in the last 30, 40 years, I think. They've been doing pretty heavy research, in these American researchers, experimental. So they do a lot of lab stuff, and they're actually taking Ernest Becker's philosophies about how culture has become this buffer for existential terror, so that the human individual doesn't have to experience that existential terror, which we're talking about fear, deep unconscious fear, which is the fear of death itself, of mortality, that humans have the consciousness to be self-aware of, but it's a very unpleasant thought for the most part. At least that's kind of the theory basis that I'm giving you of Becker's work, and how culture comes in and implants to support us to not be so terrified. And it goes even further than that. And so sort of maybe a positive side to how cultures helps us to deal with this deep unconscious fear of death, mortality, inevitable for all of us. And at the same time, not just with that positive aspect, it has a shadow side. And again, this is what you won't see so much in the fear management folks and their formulas for dealing with fear. The shadow side is much deeper investigation required to get to the deepest roots. And the shadow being, again, more unconscious, more and more unconscious to understand, which doesn't mean we can't get some good insights on it. We can, but we have to use different techniques and these cognitive behavioral strategies. So existential analysis has come up with techniques to get to it. Existential psychotherapy, for example, has as well. And there's other modes, but today I'm focusing on existential. So I'm going to read a little excerpt from Experimental Existential Psychology Handbook, talking about terror management theory. And I'll just kind of walk you through this quote, which I think is quite good to lead us into getting to this better understanding of why there's going to be a resistance to wanting to look at fear, talk about it. And it's still there today, and I definitely see it still there today. Great resistance. So let's start this off, and I'll cite these authors and give an index at the bottom of the video where you can look this up yourself if you want. So I'm just giving you a short excerpt from one of their chapters in this book. So they start off with Otto Rank in 1941 and Ernest Becker, 1973, articulated the intrapersonal struggles that humans face when confronting their own mortality. Their ideas formed the foundation for an influential theory, terror management theory, TMT for short, in the early 90s. According to terror management theory, the knowledge, inevitability, and imminence of death, if pondered consciously and deliberately, can induce paralyzing feelings of terror, sometimes called dread, panic, anxiety. Therefore, in self-preservation, says this terror management theory, humans deflect death-related thoughts and existential terror by engaging in two symbolic strategies. First, they suppress thoughts of their death. So we're going to look at this first strategy to avoid, suppress death thought reminders that might come to us in moments. both accidentally and or we may consciously think about our death, or it may just arise under certain conditions. So the first strategy is suppress thoughts of death. And they, again, experimentally, many studies, these terror management theorists have shown this to be the case. And so it's kind of an individual psychological strategy. It's very sort of proximal. In other words, it's immediate. It's a short-term gain to suppress and deny really painful, really terrifying, panic-like thoughts about our existence and our vulnerability. Well, I was thinking about that first strategy, that it's sort of very similar to, one could translate it easily as a fearologist, that humans also therefore suppress thoughts about fear. If fear of death, say the existentialists, is the core fear that's being avoided, it's known and then pushed into the unconscious to be avoided, suppressed, then fear itself, any thoughts about fear itself, if you follow those thoughts of fear, which again, it might be about a poisonous spider on the surface, but if you actually follow the thread of that thought, it's going to lead to the big fear thought, right? The fear of mortality. Why else would you be afraid of a poisonous spider? Is because it could do you in if you get bit. I'm showing the link in the depth from the surface symptom to the existential depth, unconscious, suppressed fear of one's mortality. Extinction, elimination, the big delete, forever, at least in the form that you are in now, this embodied form. All right, so that's the beginning of a first strategy that has been well proven, well shown, that people suppress the thoughts of death. And I'm saying, well, that they also are suppressing more or less thoughts of just fear itself, and do not really want to talk about fear, period, because in some ways it sort of leads to that same unpleasant mortality fear. All right, so that's the first strategy, and that will help explain why people are resistant to fearology and the study of fear itself. The second strategy they implement, humans generally, is a self-esteem maintenance or elevation tactic. Self-esteem maintenance or elevation tactic when they are somewhat confronted with this existential death. And that, again, could be accidental. It could be you witness something that's related to death or reminds you of, or maybe it's the poisonous spider, maybe it's you just had somebody die who's close to you. And those feelings can come up and the thoughts of your own mortality. And one of the strategies that these researchers have found systematically, these, again, well-established, has been well-defended, well-published studies, show that humans will move to finding any kind of strategy to build their self-esteem when they're under that threat of even an unconscious reminder through a machine that blinks a certain thought about death at you at such a small millisecond that you don't even consciously see it on the screen. Those people still behave differently when they've had that death reminder compared to people who have not had that death reminder on the same psychological task in a lab. It's pretty interesting stuff to show how we are very quickly triggered on mortality, our extinction, and then we'll develop self-esteem strategies. So then we'll often inflate ourselves to be thinking we're greater or greater than somebody else, greater about something, or be very positive about ourselves, give ourselves quick affirmations when that existential dread, terror is triggered. Again, even unconsciously, when you don't even know you're feeling that feeling of dread, panic, terror. That's how tightly wired we are to avoid that. I'm going to suggest part of that is natural survival strategy, perhaps biological, if that's even able to tease that out. It could be genetic. But I'm going to argue that's also almost all culturally conditioned, and through religious practices, cultural practices, we have learned to do this. We've learned to suppress fear of death rather than facing it and seeing it as part of life. So there's a whole analysis there philosophically about the origins of dualism and coming into development of the individual and in culture, and how that's been learned and as part of a curriculum of dualism, putting life against death. Thus the denial of death being essential to that againstness that Ernest Becker talked about. So I'm just touching surfaces here, but two strategies we have now. And that self-inflation can also be part of a narcissistic inflation to protect the individual self, make them feel better about themselves, rather than thinking about, hey, you know what, you're going to die like everybody else no matter what. No matter how good you are, no matter how great you are, no matter how famous you are, you're going to die like a piece of meat like everybody else. Yeah, this is part of our biological sensibility that knows that is true. It's empirically true. And so we'll build other defenses like, well, I can be a good person if I do these certain religious practices or even just moral practices. Perhaps there's a reward in the life after. And so then I'll feel better about myself because I'm going to be at the right hand of God, for example, in the next life. These are defense mechanisms, fundamentally, says terror management theory. Okay, defense mechanisms. Shields against experiencing existential terror. That is the unconscious fears. So Fearology wants to study all the kinds of fears. We have to study the existential fear. We have to study the unconscious, as Freud knew and many others. Rolla May, etc. The second, or sometimes it's a third strategy from some researchers, and some that part of the second strategy, is to gain self-esteem because we're a social being. Is the third strategy is we conform to the norm of the culture, worldview, and their norms, their status quo, their beliefs. And when we become very nationalistic, we become very culturalistic, ethnocentric, very quickly when we're reminded of those death threats. Again, this has been shown in empirical studies that are very cleverly designed. I've seen them on films of this research. And the arguments I find quite compelling for these buffer strategies. And you can see that when you adopt a cultural norm and want to become part of that, it gives you a sense of immortality. And that's part of building the self-esteem. I'll still be around because my culture still will remember me. And I'll be part of this culture, which will go on after I'm gone. And that's true. Culture will go on. The culture you belong to, your family line, your worldview will go on. Far past, right? Your own personal death. And so that's another adaptive strategy, a kind of crutch to facing the existential reality of your own biological death as an organism in form. Thus, says terror management theory, philosophy, as well as actual empirical research backing it up. So if under the threat of, again, existential terror that you can't even feel sometimes, that's the point here. It's so subtle and unconscious and so suppressed from even being felt because of these defensive strategies of suppression, that when you start adopting the cultural norms, you pretty well are adopting, as far as I'm concerned, the very fear-based cultural strategies to manage fear that will not get you beyond, it certainly won't get you to fearlessness. It will get you to so-called coping, maybe better, maybe even not better, with fear. That's about what you're going to be left with. Coping strategies, not healing strategies, not liberation strategies in true sense of transcendence, not a kind of pseudo-transcendence of escape to another world. Thus, there's terror management theory. And you can see I have a lot of respect for that theory. I think it has a lot of validity and a lot of strength as a social scientific approach to understanding deep fear and its motivations, its strategies of buffering, which again, all will lead to more or less not wanting to talk about fear, to study fear deeper, and certainly not wanting to support the whole field of fearology. And that's not a horrible thing in some sense, right? It's like, you know, anything new at some level starts to become difficult to get people to be interested in because they'll think it's stupid or whatever. It's new, different, never been done. So I would encourage any students in the Fearology Institute and others who don't have to be in the Fearology Institute to be interested in Fearology to think about some of those things that I've mentioned today and study terror management theory yourself. As some possible explanations. It's really got lots of implications I haven't even begun to mention today. So yeah, that's about pretty much what I wanted to cover. Look forward to your responses again, and let's continue the conversation on why there's resistance. And it's not like resistance is bad. Let me be very clear about that. But resistance to knowledge and knowing and a depth investigation critically into how we come to understand fear, create knowledge of fear, and then play out fear management strategies based on that knowledge base. Yeah, we have to be critical, and so we want to examine those resistances, not make them bad or blame or shame, create more fear, but critically investigate. All right, so welcome to the world of fearology. Bye-bye.